We are excited to have Paul Colt here with us. He's here to talk about the story that he has in our Rough Country anthology. Hey, Paul, can you tell us the name of that story?
That's Codename Cowboy.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about the story itself?
Well, it has its roots in a nonfiction book, really, that Killers of the Flower Moon, if you may recall, was bestseller. And one of the characters in that book was an FBI agent early in the agency's history, not long after it was founded. And Hoover was an interesting character in many respects, but the FBI in the days that we write about didn't have arrest authority. They didn't do really crime investigations as much as they were lawyers, they were accountants, and they did white collar kinds of things. Almost all of them were that way, except for there were a few former Texas Rangers who worked out of the Texas offices, in the case of Codename Cowboy, the Houston office. And they were sort of throwbacks. They did dirty work. They packed firearms, got their boots dirty doing what they did. And so kind of took that character and put him into a historically contemporary position where Pancho Villa had gone and made peace with the president, and had kind of gone into retirement. But he had notions of coming out of retirement. And so the predicate of the story is that some of Villa's Dorado guard, his personal bodyguard, raid into New Mexico and rob a train. And they come away with $100,000 in gold. That was a shipment coming out of the San Francisco Mint. And so because of the sensitivity of the cross-border raid, our ace gets summoned to Washington and sent on a clandestine mission to notify the Mexican government trouble was coming, and to see if it would be possible to find out where the leak came that tipped them off to that gold shipment. And so our detective goes into Mexico, and that is the story of Codename Cowboy.
That sounds like a lot of fun. So just kind of reading through the story, your main character, Tom Knight, he feels like he kind of rides right out of history. He's gritty, kind of that instinct driven, but he's a little out of step with all the polish, all the things that are going on in Washington at that time. And wondering, kind of with all of the authenticity of your writing and kind of that hands-on research that we know that you do, how much of that realism comes from your own connection to what you've done in the past in your own history?
Well, the Villa connection goes back to my book, Boots and Saddles, A Call to Glory, which is a historical novel based on a little-known chapter in George Patton's early career, because Villa actually did raid Columbus, New Mexico, in the run-up towards the First World War, and President Wilson sent General Pershing into Mexico chasing Villa. And little-known sidebar to that is that George Patton was with him as a staff officer in that campaign. He was going through a career crisis, mid-career crisis, cavalry officer, and the cavalry was, its days were numbered. You could see that coming. He could see it coming, and so he was thinking of resigning his commission. And Pershing put his arm around him and saved his career. So the research that we did for that book embraced Villa and much of his career as a revolutionary. So I've come back to him a couple of different times. This story, Codename Cowboy being one of them. I've got a novella that Ronan Weatherford is in some stages of production that also has got a little known and underreported slice of Villa's early career as a bandit. Mm-hmm. And so that research has been useful at multiple levels. Research is an underpinning of much of what I do, and sometimes you get to use it more than once.
That makes your job, I would hope, a little bit easier, getting to reuse your research over. So I'm curious, especially in this specific story, but obviously in any of your others as well, how do you decide which historical details to pull in and which areas to maybe kind of lean into the fiction side a little bit more? Is that a difficult balance for you?
It really depends on the story. In a book like Boots and Saddles, A Call to Glory, that was very historical. The fictional elements were strictly, or as strictly as you can do it, limited to putting words in the mouths of the characters, and yet doing so in a way that remains as faithful as you can to who that character was. And to give you an illustration of that, in the case of Patton in that book, whether we like it or not, George C. Scott is Patton for all of us. So what you had to do was try to be faithful to that icon about 20 years removed from the Patton we know as that icon. So that's a very historically focused book, and most of my historical novels are. When I get into historical fiction, like the story in Rough Country, then fiction gets more latitude. The story itself is fictional. The Villa caricature is borderline. The FBI connection, there's some roots there, but Tom Knight is modeled after what those Texas Ranger throwbacks were, but he's a fictional character, as is the crime itself.
I think that makes it really fun. I think he's part of the intrigue and part of the draw to the story as well. I know a lot of people will say once they start reading one of your books, then that's it. They're stuck. They can't put it down again. So I think that's part of the draw for people, is those interesting characters that are kind of a mix of gritty or have their instincts and, are a little displaced maybe or in a new situation. So I wanted to ask you about that. In this story, we've got kind of a few different genres that blend together here. It feels a little bit, kind of Western, classical, a little bit spy story, a little bit kind of historical thriller, maybe. Did you do that intentionally, or is that just kind of where the story took you as you were going along?
I really did it because it's a little bit out of my wheelhouse in terms of the periods that I typically write about. I'm usually dealing in, the 70s, 80s kind of time frame. So the early 20th century is, I've been there with boots and saddles, but it's not my wheelhouse, if you will. But I knew the thrust that we were trying to get with this analogy, and being familiar with some of the guys and other authors who are in it. I tried to do something that would be consistent with the kind of feel that they get, if that makes sense.
A lot of the fun from this story kind of comes from the fact that, there's this big contrast between Knight's style and this buttoned up Washington establishment and all of those things. So how did you kind of come up with that tension? Was that something you started with and did intentionally, or did you kind of massage it as you went?
No, it was very intentional, because I knew the contrast. And in fact, the DC buttoned down agents, and they referred to the guys from Texas as cowboys. They were these throwbacks who did business in ways that we don't do business anymore. Weren't authorized to do business that way. But even Hoover, who was the architect of that whole persona, if you will, that the agency carried with it, I knew that he didn't just tolerate those cowboys. He knew when to use them. And that was one of the things that I took away from reading Killers of the Flower Moon. When he encountered situations, Hoover did, where he needed somebody who was capable of doing wet work, and so he didn't boot those guys out of the Corps for wearing boots and Stetsons. He used them and put them to work where they were needed to go to work.
I think that's really interesting as I'm thinking about kind of that period in history when things were changing so much, and how they worked within the bounds of what was going on, and yet Hoover still reached out to this cowboy type figure. I think is just really fascinating. I really love kind of the difference between the two worlds. I think it's great.
Yeah, no, it's. And then he's a kind of an unconventional character too, in that in the climax to the story, the way he goes about outing the individual who tipped Villa's people off to the raid. It probably didn't come out of any FBI textbook that Hoover would have approved of, but he got the job done.
Yeah, that's so cool, because Hoover was, you picture as being very straight-laced. Here's how it has to be done. So the unconventional nature of that is, I think, very fascinating.
Did you feel like you had like a hurdle at all to try to educate the readers that the FBI we're talking about in this story may not be the way you picture the FBI now? It's kind of a different world, or do you feel like that just kind of naturally got built into the story?
Those are the kind of hooks that attract me to a story, especially in the historical fiction realm, or historical novel realm, or the historical biographical novels that I've done. Of my historical work, my goal is to entertain and inform. Some of the reader feedback I get often is, wow, this is history. I'm enjoying it. It was a pain when I was taking it in school and memorizing dates and all that stuff. This is historically significant, and I can see historically significant information coming out of this entertaining story. So it's an entertain and inform, purposeful goal of mine in developing a story that's got historical roots to it.
That's so interesting. I think you must, while you're doing your research, be kind of building ideas as they come to you. And I wonder if that's partially what makes your story so engaging to people, is that, natural offshoot of finding something interesting that happened in history and then kind of following it, in a fictional way. Do you feel like your research follows more following the history of actual events, or do you find something interesting and then follow that to learn more to build out a story? Does that make sense?
If I get my hooks in a story, I get my boots dirty. I did a trilogy on Billy the Kid, and so, for example, when he broke out of the Lincoln County Jail, there's a bullet hole in the wall on the stairwell he went down. I put my finger in that bullet hole. Another one of my books is set in the Kansas-Missouri border conflict. And, my wife and I went researching battlefields and John Brown's compound and a hotel that's been burned down 3 times during the course of the war. We stayed in it. I mean, we get our boots dirty doing that. The Grasshoppers in Summer was a Spur Award honoree and a Will Rogers Medallion Award winner. That one, I did the Pahasapa, the Black Hills, on horseback as part of the research to that study or that story. So yeah, the history is important to me when it's a historical novel or a biographical novel. Yeah, I want to get a feel for it, for the character, as well as the land and the settings in which it all took place.
I love your deep research. I love that you're out experiencing the spaces. I think so often when we're looking at what's going on in history, that we're so focused on the bigger things, the George Washingtons, all the pieces that came early, that's our country's history. And I think that we miss a lot of these other things like what you're exploring. So I love that. And I love that you've been one of the Will Rogers Medallion Award recognition and the other awards you've gotten, I think is so telling of all of the work that you've done in that research area. I think that's just fascinating. Do you have, as a part of all of the research that you've done and the trips that you've done, do you have a favorite? Do you have a favorite space or trip that you can tell us about?
Wow. That's a very good question. There were elements to all of them that we came away with memories of. That Vaquero Padre was fascinating. The Eusebio Kino biographical novel, who was a 17th century missionary, Jesuit missionary in northern Mexico and the southwestern U.S. Part of his area was Tucson, in the area around Tucson, and one of his missions is still standing and operational just outside of Houston. And so, one of the research trips I was able to take was to visit that mission. Francisco Xavier del Bac, and beautiful, gorgeous church, and that was a memorable. The bullet hole in the wall in Lincoln County was interesting because Lincoln, New Mexico, has one street. Count 'em. We stayed in Ruidoso. We did not stay in Lincoln, although we could have, but Lincoln was somewhat limited. And then the Kansas border war, we saw, we visited a lot of historical, interesting historical places in that trip as well.
You're naming like a bunch of people I've never heard of, and now I want to go do some research myself. I'm like, oh, those all sound like really cool things. So thank you for sharing those.
It sounds like your love of the research and the trips might happen even if you weren't intentionally doing research, if you were just, enjoying the history. You think that's true? Do you think you do more research because you're writing, or do you think you would kind of fall into it anyway, just, as a hobby or for fun?
Well, it's funny how that stuff happens. The origin of the Billy the Kid trilogy, I kind of got interested in his story, and I'd never been to New Mexico. And so I said, I want to go to New Mexico. So the trilogy resulted in part, at least, from a desire to see that part of the world.
That's great. I think you can feel an author's interest in the topic. You can feel it coming through. And I think that's partially why your readers find your work so engaging, is they can feel your interest is coming through to them as they're reading, and obviously making it feel like a fun adventure and less like, a boring history lesson. So.
Yeah, I know it's and then you get into some interesting characters too. I mean, book that Rowan Weatherford did just a year or so ago called Lunger. It's the Doc Holliday story. It's a biographical novel of Doc Holliday. And what made that one interesting was that I had 3 different sources, non-fictional sources, that I used as part of the research. One was a book by Chris Enns, whom you guys have probably run across. Her book on Kate Elder was one source. And then I had a book on Doc Holliday written by his Georgia family. So it was highly sanitized as to Doc's, the senior side of Doc's existence. And then I had a couple of other books that were more focused on Wyatt Earp, but Doc Holliday got a lot of play in those books. And so in essence, we triangulated the character and tried to build that character out of the composite of what Kate thought and what his family wanted us to think and what his buddies like Wyatt thought. And hopefully the character that comes to life in that book is something close to Doc Holliday.
That's a lot of fun. So I'm thinking about all this history and all of those things. So what was it that got you started writing?
Got me started writing?
Yeah.
That's interesting. I've written, I was involved in writing various things throughout my career, but it was a business career. And frankly, I always thought I would write a book someday, but I thought it would be a serious business book, nonfiction. And then in my 50s, I started thinking about retirement and what am I going to do? And I thought, well, I'd write a book. And when I was a kid, I had a pretty vivid imagination. And somewhere along the way, at around 52 or so, I discovered, oops, I still have it. Well, I started dabbling. And I dabbled for a while, and pretty soon I had something that I thought was a book. And so I went I was home from a ranch trip in Wyoming, and I had the book, my first one, finished, and I thought, I'm ready to go find an agent or a publisher. And so I'm plunking around looking at where I can go with it. It ended up being a Western because I grew up on Westerns, grew up on horses. They say write what you know. I knew which end the oats went in, and I knew where they came out. So, it had to be a Western. So I stumbled on the website for the Western Writers of America. And lo and behold, there are Western authors with contact information. Whoa! So I picked out a half a dozen of them, wrote a little email, cover email, told them who I was, what I was up to, and asked if they had any words of wisdom. 4 of the 6 got back to me. And they all said, send me a chapter or 2 or something that I can read. So I did. I was thrilled. And then the replies came back, all with politely worded versions of the same not ready for prime time.
Oh,
That's such a nice way to say it.
yeah.
Huh?
That's such a nice way to say it.
Well, they had all kinds of nice ways to say it, but that was the message. One of them was a guy named Dusty Richards, which I'm sure you have heard of. And Dusty Richards came back to me and he said, I want you to rewrite it. Here's what I want you to do. And I didn't know the man from Adam. He didn't know me from the next door neighbor. For the next year, Dusty beat on my readings and writings until that aha moment finally landed. And I said, this is all by email. We didn't even talk on the phone. I said, I think I get it. I won't bother you until I got something worth your while. I rewrote the whole book. And then I sent him the new first chapter. I still have the email that he sent in reply. He said, done with authority. I bought it as history. I wouldn't change a thing. And I never say that.
Wow.
That was Dusty. The following year, WWA had their convention in Cody, Wyoming. And my wife and I went and met Dusty. And for the next more than a decade, until we lost him, we became, as he put it, pards. And there aren't enough words to thank that man for what he did for me.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Well, we could all have mentors like that.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't happen. It would never have happened for me without that. And so I've tried to follow in his footsteps. When a newbie asks for if I'd help, or if I'd read something, or if I'd help him with something, I make it a point to say yes. And a couple of the guys in Ronan Weatherford's stable, I help get there.
That's amazing. I think having that mentor relationship is so useful and so important. It's great that you're able to pass that on. You know the value of that relationship and be able to give that benefit to other writers. That's incredible. So with this anthology, it's benefiting the U.S. Marshals Museum. So when you were writing your story for this anthology, were you thinking about the kind of themes that tie into the U.S. Marshals, like frontier justice or the kind of the evolution of law enforcement, anything like that?
I was just trying to keep up with Revis Wortham. I was a spur judge a few years ago when he won his spur for Hawk's Target, and he does a yarn and a half, and so I was thrilled to be invited to participate in the anthology because the U.S. Marshal Service is a worthwhile and worthy cause, no doubt about it. But for me, the challenge was trying to keep up with that guy and the people that he assembled to be part of that anthology. It's an honor to be numbered among them.
Well, it certainly has been a lot of fun for us because we've gotten to interview quite a few of those people that are involved in the anthology with you. And you are all just a lot of fun, and the stories are so amazing. And this one is especially fun given the history of it. One of the things I love to ask all of our authors as they're coming on is, did you have a book, or do you have a favorite book that, has made a difference for you in your reading or your writing, something that kind of touched you as you were growing up or as you've been writing in this space?
It's more authors who influenced me than a single work. Jeff Shara is one who does historical novels so well. And while he deals with Civil War and World War II are his sort of his fields, the way he tells the stories and the way he animates the historical events and characters was very inspirational to me. The other thing that I pay a lot of attention to when I'm reading authors is dialogue. Writing good dialogue is an art in itself. If you can carry the dialogue without having to use a lot of dialogue tags, because if the characters are well developed enough, a scene can unfold with little more than an opener or maybe a reminder along the way, but the dialogue gets carried back and forth between those speakers just because it's good dialogue. And so I one of the things that I test myself on and test authors that I read on is how good is the dialogue.
Thank you so much for being with us today. I think it's going to be a lot of fun for readers when we release this anthology, for them to be able to read all of these stories, and especially this one has been a lot of fun.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. Enjoyed meeting both of you.
Same here. It's been a lot of fun spending time with you today.